Quick reminder, sex isn't a sin. Sexual immorality is. I notice that this isn't talked about much in the church, and it's even shied away from in homes as well. Some people think that if we don't talk about it, then maybe we just won't fall into it. But what we're actually doing is, we are allowing the world to fill in the gaps that God has already filled. God lets us know the boundaries, and he tells us what a healthy marriage is and what it looks like, and what sexual immorality looks like. And if we don't talk about it, the world will. So with that being said, I want to first talk about what God's intent was. Matthew 19:5 says, and said, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." We see that it is God's intent for sex to be reserved for marriage and for one person, being the spouse. And we see in this next verse, Hebrews 13:4, "Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge." Here it tells us not to sleep with those we are not married to, for it says God will be the judge of them. And in Hebrews, it says that marriage is honorable among all. Therefore, let us be honorable and wait until marriage. 1 Corinthians 7:2, "But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband." Here it also tells us to only have sexual relations with our spouse. Then we see in Mark 10:9, "What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." Now I want to talk about what God's intent wasn't. Romans 1:26-27. "Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for the error." We see that God's intent was for man and for woman to become one flesh, not for man and man or for woman and woman. This does not mean that we have the right to condemn others, but we cannot deny what God's intent was not. Genesis 34:2, "And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, he took her and lay with her, and violated her. Later, Jacob's two sons killed all the Hivites' men." We see here that sex was not meant to be forceful, but rather with two consenting parties. We also see that in the next verse, 2 Samuel 13:14-15, "But Amnon wouldn't listen to her, and since he was stronger than she was, he raped her. Then suddenly Amnon's love became hate, and he hated her even more than he loved her. 'Get out of here,' he snarled at her." The whole of this chapter is about Amnon and his scheme. And we see here that it was not God's intent for there to be rape at all in this world. And we know that God's intent is to satisfy and to think of the other person above yourself. Now, you might have heard all of that before, because if there's anything that is taught on this subject, it's a lot of don'ts. But I want to show you that sex is actually a gift from God, not for the sole purpose of to be reproducing. Genesis 1:28, "And God blessed them and said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it.'" God tells us not only to multiply, but also to be fruitful. God gave us sex as a gift, not as a stumbling block. If you still think it's not a gift from God, and you think it's something to shy away from, look at the book of Song of Solomon, or otherwise known as the Song of Songs. It's a whole book of Solomon and his wife and their romance and intimacy. Guys, this is the Bible, the Word of God. If he doesn't shy away from it, neither should we. 1 Corinthians 7:5, "Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come back together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." This is including sex, and this is talking about sex from verses 7:1 all the way to 7:5. And I want to finish this all by saying, all of God's creation is good within its context and design. We have taken sex out of context, and when we have taken God's creation out of context, it becomes sin. Sex is a beautiful thing, and it might take some getting used to, and also sex is a dangerous thing when taken out of context. And this is why we follow the clear guide of what God intended sex to be, and not what we think we can get away with.